Welcome to our channel. Today we're sharing a powerful story about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of service. It's a tale of a Swiss guard who faces a life-changing decision, and the wisdom of Pope Francis that guides him through it. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you won't miss tomorrow's special story. Let's dive in and explore how sometimes breaking tradition is the most powerful way to serve. What Pope Francis said that made a Swiss guard rethink his duty. In the heart of Vatican City, Lance Corporal Thomas stood at his post, his sharp blue and yellow Swiss guard uniform gleaming under the morning sun. His halberd rested against the cold stone of the Vatican walls as he kept his eyes fixed ahead, his posture as rigid as the centuries-old traditions he had been taught to uphold. He was part of an elite force, a symbol of the Vatican's strength and security. His duty was clear: protect the Pope, guard the gates, uphold tradition. But as the days passed, Thomas found himself questioning the true meaning of his service. It wasn't that he didn't respect the role he had been entrusted with. On the contrary, he was proud to serve the Pope, proud of his role in the history of the Swiss Guard. But something felt missing. Every day he stood at attention, watching the crowds pass by, watching the faithful and the tourists fill St. Peter's Square. Yet amid the grandeur of his uniform and the importance of his duty, he couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. He wasn't just standing still physically. He felt frozen inside, disconnected from the humanity around him. The more Thomas stood in silence, the more he felt distant from the life he was protecting. Was his only purpose to be a symbol of discipline, a human statue for the world to admire? Was this really all there was to his service? The thought gnawed at him, and the weight of tradition seemed heavier with every passing day. He longed for something deeper, something that went beyond the ceremonial precision of his job. One day, as Thomas stood in the shadow of the Vatican's towering walls, he noticed a small group of people gathered near the gates, but one individual stood out to him. A young boy, no older than 10, had become separated from his family. The boy's eyes were wide with fear as he looked around, lost in the bustling crowd. For a split second, Thomas hesitated. Protocol dictated that he should remain at his post and wait for assistance. But in that moment, something inside him stirred. He saw the boy's panic, and something in him broke free from the rigid hold of duty. Without a second thought, Thomas stepped away from his post, walking toward the boy with slow, deliberate steps. He knelt down to the boy's level, offering a warm smile. Gently, he took the boy's hand and guided him through the crowd, helping him reunite with his family. It was a small act, but it felt monumental to Thomas. He had broken tradition. Yes, but he had done something that felt more aligned with his heart than with any rule. He hadn't just protected the Pope that day. He had protected a child, shown compassion, and connected with another human being. When Thomas returned to his post, he felt a shift within him. The heaviness that had clouded his thoughts lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that went beyond protocol. He had acted from a place of humanity, not duty. And in doing so, he had found something more powerful than tradition, a deeper connection to the people he was sworn to protect. Later, Pope Francis came to him in private, having witnessed the act of kindness. True service, the Pope said with a kind smile, is not just about standing still or following orders. It's about serving others with compassion, with love. And you've done just that today. Thomas's heart swelled with gratitude. He had always thought his role was defined by duty, by the rules. But in that moment, he realized that the truest form of service was one driven by the heart. It wasn't about being immovable. It was about knowing when to act with love, when to step outside the lines and make a real difference. The Pope's words resonated deeply within him, and for the first time, Thomas truly understood the meaning of his service. The days that followed were both a blessing and a challenge for Thomas. While he had found a moment of clarity in helping the lost child, the weight of his decision to step away from his post lingered in the back of his mind. His duty as a Swiss guard was clear: protect the Pope, maintain order, uphold the rigid traditions that had been passed down through generations. Yet his heart told him something different. He couldn't shake the feeling that true service meant more than simply standing still, more than adhering to tradition without question. Thomas continued his patrols, but his thoughts were no longer focused solely on the uniform, the halberd, or the pristine expectations of his role. As he walked the corridors of the Vatican, he couldn't help but reflect on the act of compassion he had shown to the young boy. Was he wrong to step outside the lines of protocol? Was it a mistake to place human connection above his ceremonial duty? One afternoon, while on duty in the Vatican's grand courtyard, Thomas received an unexpected message. Pope Francis wished to see him. His heart skipped a beat. He had never been called for a private audience with the Pope before. Was this a reprimand? Or had the Pope noticed his actions and wanted to speak to him about the breach in protocol? Either way, Thomas felt a sense of anticipation and unease. He had always respected Pope Francis, admired his compassion and humility, but now he was unsure how the Pope would view his recent decisions. When Thomas entered the small, simple room where the Pope awaited, he was struck by the warmth of the space. Pope Francis sat at a small wooden desk, his simple white robes a stark contrast to the ornate surroundings. There was no sense of grandiosity, just a calm, welcoming presence. As Thomas stood before him, the Pope motioned for him to sit, his smile gentle. "I've been watching you," Pope Francis said softly. His eyes were kind but probing, as if searching Thomas's soul. "You've made a decision, haven't you? A decision that goes against tradition." Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what the Pope meant. "Yes, Your Holiness," he said quietly. I broke protocol. I stepped away from my post to help someone who needed it. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but it felt right." Pope Francis leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You did exactly what needed to be done. Sometimes tradition blinds us to what truly matters. Our duty to serve others with love, with compassion. It's easy to forget that the people we are sworn to protect are not just symbols of faith, but human beings, just like us." Thomas felt a surge of relief but also confusion. He had always been taught that duty was paramount, that following the rules was what made a good soldier. Yet here Pope Francis was telling him that breaking tradition wasn't necessarily wrong. It could be the most compassionate choice. "True service is not about standing still, Thomas," the Pope continued. "It's about acting when the moment calls for it, even if it means stepping outside the lines. You have learned something that many soldiers never do. That duty without compassion is hollow. You've shown that protecting others means caring for them, even when it's not part of the plan." The weight in Thomas's chest, the uncertainty that had clouded his mind since his decision, began to lift. For the first time, he understood what Pope Francis had meant by service. It wasn't about the uniform or the orders. It was about the people he was meant to serve. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a human being, and his service to the Pope was not defined by rigidity, but by the compassion he brought to his role. As the conversation came to an end, Pope Francis placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I see great potential in you, Thomas. You've just begun to understand the true meaning of service. Don't be afraid to act from the heart." As Thomas left the room, he felt a new sense of purpose. He had come to the Vatican as a young man bound by duty, but he was leaving with a new understanding. Service was not about standing still, but about moving forward with compassion. The path ahead would be different, but it was one he now felt ready to walk, with the Pope's wisdom guiding him every step of the way. After his conversation with Pope Francis, Thomas couldn't shake the sense of clarity that had settled deep within him. The Pope had given him permission to think beyond the traditional confines of duty, to lead with his heart instead of solely adhering to protocol. For days he walked the Vatican's quiet halls, processing the new perspective the Pope had given him. It felt both liberating and terrifying. Had he truly understood what Pope Francis had meant? Was it really okay to step outside tradition when it felt right? Or had he simply been blinded by his own desire for change? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but as he continued his duties, Thomas began to notice the small ways in which his perspective was shifting. When he walked through the crowds in St. Peter's Square, he no longer saw the people as mere observers of the church, but as human beings with their own stories, struggles, and needs. It was a small, subtle change in his way of thinking, but it was profound. He was beginning to understand that his role as a protector wasn't just about guarding the Pope from harm. It was about protecting the dignity and humanity of everyone around him. Then, one fateful afternoon, Thomas was called upon again in a way he hadn't expected. The Vatican had received word of a serious threat from an extremist group. Security was tightened, and every guard was stationed in strategic locations, but the threat seemed increasingly real. The atmosphere around the Vatican shifted from its usual calm to a palpable sense of unease. Everyone, from the highest-ranking officials to the youngest guards, was on high alert. As Thomas took his position near the entrance to the Apostolic Palace, his mind raced. The old protocols kicked in, the focus, the vigilance, the instinct to protect at all costs. But there was something else inside him now, something the Pope had awakened. As he scanned the crowd, his gaze fell on a woman holding a small child, her face anxious as she tried to navigate through the crowds. Something about her seemed off. She was too anxious, too lost in the sea of people. Without thinking, Thomas moved toward her. His duty was to remain in position, to guard the perimeter, but in that instant his heart told him otherwise. The woman, clearly panicked, couldn't find her way to the exit and seemed lost, vulnerable. Without hesitation, Thomas stepped away from his post, breaking protocol again, but this time it didn't feel wrong. He approached the woman and asked if she needed help. She looked up at him, startled, then immediately burst into tears. "I lost my husband," she said, her voice trembling. "We were supposed to meet at the other side of the square, but I couldn't find him. My child is scared." Thomas didn't hesitate. He led her through the crowd, guiding her toward the exit where she could meet her family. The whole time, the weight of his decision was in his mind. But this wasn't about following the rules. It was about acting with compassion. This was what Pope Francis had meant. True service was about protecting people, not just positions or ceremonial duties. As the woman and child were reunited, Thomas couldn't help but feel the relief wash over him. He had acted from the heart, and it had been the right thing to do. Just then, he received a signal to return to his post. The threat had passed. Thankfully, it was a false alarm. But for Thomas, the moment felt like more than just a passing event. It was a reaffirmation of everything he had learned from Pope Francis. Sometimes protecting others didn't require standing still. It required stepping forward, showing compassion, and doing what was right, even when it wasn't the easy choice. Returning to his post, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He was still a Swiss guard, still sworn to protect the Pope, but he was no longer bound by tradition alone. He was guided by something greater: compassion, humanity, and the understanding that true service came from the heart. After the incident with the woman and child, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the moment. It was something he had never done before, stepping away from his post, breaking tradition for the sake of helping someone in need. But it had felt right, more right than anything he had done in his life as a Swiss guard. The act had been small, a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things, but to Thomas it was a turning point. For the first time, he felt the weight of his service shift. It wasn't just about following orders, it was about protecting people, truly serving them. But as days passed, he found himself confronting a deeper conflict. The thrill of doing the right thing still lingered, but so did the unease that came with it. Was he truly allowed to break the rules when it felt right? Was he still a good soldier if he allowed his emotions to guide his actions? His internal struggle grew with each passing day. While his actions had been praised by some, others in the guard whispered about his behavior, questioning his loyalty to tradition. The tension reached its peak one evening, when a new, high-profile delegation arrived at the Vatican. The stakes were higher than ever, as world leaders would be attending a private mass with Pope Francis. The security measures were tightened, and the guards were told to expect a higher risk of protesters and potential disruptions. It was an event that demanded the highest levels of discipline and control. Thomas was assigned to a key position at the main entrance, overseeing the security for Pope Francis's arrival. His uniform was impeccably sharp, his halberd steady in his hand, his mind alert for any sign of danger. The usual stillness of his post settled over him, but deep inside, there was an unsettling tension. The question that had been quietly echoing in his mind resurfaced. Was it possible to reconcile his duty as a soldier with the compassion that had begun to define him? As the procession began, Thomas scanned the crowd. His eyes, trained to see beyond the surface, locked onto a figure that didn't quite fit. The man stood out, his eyes darting nervously, constantly shifting his gaze. Thomas's instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but he hesitated. It wasn't a direct threat, just a feeling, a shift in the energy of the crowd. It was then that he saw the man slip something into his coat pocket, a small object, shiny and metal, reflecting the light. Thomas's heartbeat quickened, and he didn't wait to make sure. Without a second thought, he moved toward the individual, his decision swift and clear. As he approached the man, he reached out, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, may I ask what's in your coat?" Thomas asked, his hand gently but decisively guiding the man to stop. The man froze, his face going pale, before quickly reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, concealed object. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make anyone uneasy. I'm sorry," the man stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "It's just—" Thomas didn't let him finish. He quickly signaled for the security team, and within moments the potential threat was neutralized. The situation was handled discreetly, no harm done. But as Thomas stood there, watching the man being escorted away, the weight of what he had just done hit him. This was the kind of action that demanded discipline and focus, the kind of move he had been trained to make without hesitation. But there was another feeling in him now, one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about protecting the Pope, the Vatican, or the people in front of him. It was about protecting the very essence of humanity, the right to live freely and safely. Thomas had acted quickly and decisively, but it was his compassion that had guided him, not the rules. He hadn't just acted to preserve safety, he had acted to protect the dignity of the people around him. As he returned to his post, Thomas's thoughts were clearer. The path he was walking was not one of rigid tradition or unquestioned obedience. It was one of balance. Yes, duty was important, but the service that Pope Francis spoke of was not about merely following orders. It was about knowing when to step outside the lines, when to act not just as a soldier, but as a protector of life, of kindness, of what was truly important. For the first time, Thomas felt a quiet sense of peace in his heart. He was no longer torn between tradition and compassion. He had found a way to integrate both. His service was not about being perfect. It was about making the right choices, guided by humanity and love. As the event continued, he stood at his post with a newfound sense of clarity, knowing that he was more than just a guard. He was a protector, and that was the most important duty of all. As the weeks went by, Thomas continued to serve in the U.S. Swiss Guard, his heart lighter than before. He had found a balance between his duty and the compassion that Pope Francis had instilled in him. No longer burdened by the weight of tradition alone, Thomas began to see his role with new eyes. He wasn't just a soldier standing guard. He was a protector of lives, a guardian of human dignity. One afternoon, as he stood at his usual post, overseeing a crowded St. Peter's Square, a sudden disturbance caught his attention. A man, appearing out of place among the sea of visitors, was moving erratically, pushing his way through the crowd with a look of intense panic in his eyes. Thomas's instincts immediately kicked in. There was something wrong, something that didn't fit the usual flow of the square. The man's behavior was off, too agitated to be just a tourist in a hurry. Before Thomas could process his thoughts, the man started running toward the entrance of the basilica, directly toward Pope Francis, who was making his way to the altar. Thomas's training kicked into high gear, but this time, it wasn't just about following protocol. It wasn't about standing still and waiting for instructions. It was about the people in front of him, about the safety of the Pope and those around him. Without hesitation, Thomas sprinted toward the man. His heart raced as he closed the distance. His mind clear but focused on one goal: stop the man before he reached the Pope. As he approached, the man suddenly stopped, his eyes wide with fear. There was no weapon, no immediate threat in his hands, but the tension in the air was undeniable. "Stop right there," Thomas commanded, his voice firm but not harsh, his hand ready to catch the man if necessary. The man's breath came in, short, desperate gasps as he turned toward Thomas, trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I need to speak with him. I need to—" The man stuttered, his voice shaking with desperation. Thomas's eyes softened, the adrenaline still, running through his veins. He could see the fear in the man's eyes. This wasn't a terrorist, this was a man on the edge. For a brief moment, Thomas felt that same pull, the call to protect, but also the call to show compassion. "Come with me," Thomas said gently, taking the man's arm and leading him away from the crowd. The guards quickly stepped in, ready to act, but Thomas held up a hand, signaling for them to wait. He wasn't going to let fear guide his actions this time. As he led the man away, Thomas's mind returned to Pope Francis's teachings. True service, true protection wasn't about always being rigid and unyielding. It was about knowing when to show compassion, when to listen, when to make the right choice. The Pope had been right. This was the essence of true service, the kind of service that came from the heart. As the man was safely escorted away, Thomas felt a sense of peace. He had protected the Pope, yes, but he had also protected the humanity within the crowd, and for that, he knew he had made the right choice. The days after the incident with the man in the square were a mix of reflection and quiet contemplation for Thomas. He had acted swiftly, decisively, and with compassion, but as he walked the halls of the Vatican, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he might still be missing something. Yes, he had protected the Pope, and yes, he had shown empathy. But was there a larger role he was meant to play in this world of duty and tradition? Had he fully understood what Pope Francis had tried to teach him, or was he still caught in the tension between duty and compassion? One evening, as Thomas stood by the grand doors of the Apostolic Palace, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Father Ventresca, the priest who had been a quiet but steady presence in the Vatican. The old man had always been observant yet kind, offering words of wisdom when needed. "Thomas," Father Ventresca said, his voice soft but urgent, "there's something I think you need to hear." Without a word, Thomas followed the priest down the dimly lit corridors of the Vatican. The air was cool, and the quiet weight of the place seemed to press down on him. They stopped before a small chapel, its wooden doors closed, the faint glow of candles flickering inside. Father Ventresca opened the door and motioned for Thomas to enter. Inside, Pope Francis was kneeling at the altar, his hands clasped in prayer. The sight of him, so humble, so at peace, stirred something deep within Thomas. He had been to this chapel many times, but seeing the Pope like this, in such a simple, sacred act, made the weight of his own journey even clearer. The Pope looked up as they entered, his eyes meeting Thomas's with a warmth that made the world feel a little lighter. "Come sit," Pope Francis said, gesturing to the seat beside him. "I've been waiting for you." Thomas, unsure of what to expect, sat down beside the Pope, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "You've been through a lot lately, Thomas," Pope Francis began, his voice steady but kind. "I see the struggle in your eyes, the push and pull between what you've been trained to do and what your heart is telling you." Thomas swallowed hard. "I've been trying to understand it, Your Holiness. I've followed orders my entire life, but after what happened in The square. I feel like I've changed. I don't know if I can go back to being the same soldier I was. The Pope nodded, a soft smile touching his lips. You're not supposed to go back to the way you were, Thomas. That's not the point of service. The point is to grow, to become more than what you've always been, to allow your service to evolve as you evolve. What you did that day in the square wasn't a mistake. It was a choice that reflects who you are becoming. True service comes from the heart, not from rigid obedience. Thomas felt the weight of the Pope's words settle deep within him, the tension he had been carrying for so long. This internal battle between following orders and doing what felt right began to loosen, like the final knot being untied. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace about the decision he had made. The Pope was right. Service wasn't about standing still, about following orders mindlessly. It was about knowing when to step forward, when to act out of love and compassion, and when to protect the dignity of others, no matter the cost. You've learned something vital, Thomas, Pope Francis continued, his voice gentle but firm. True leaders are those who lead with compassion, who understand that tradition must sometimes bend to the greater good. You're not just a guard to the Pope. You're a protector of people's hearts, their well-being, their humanity, and that is a responsibility you will carry with honor. Thomas's chest tightened as the weight of the Pope's words sank in. He had never thought of his role in such a way before. The responsibility he had as a Swiss guard was not just about following protocol. It was about being a living embodiment of the values that Pope Francis stood for: love, compassion, and service to others. As they stood to leave the chapel, the Pope placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his eyes filled with understanding. You are not alone in this, Thomas. As long as you lead with your heart, I believe you will find your true path. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt sure of his place in the world. His path wasn't one of strict rules or blind obedience. It was a path of service shaped by love, compassion, and the willingness to step outside the boundaries of tradition when the time called for it. He wasn't just a Swiss guard. He was a protector of something far greater than himself, and that was a role he could carry with pride. As the days passed after the private meeting with Pope Francis, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken a turn. The words of the Pope echoed in his mind, especially the ones about leading with compassion and understanding. It was as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, but a new, heavier sense of responsibility had taken its place. He wasn't just a Swiss guard anymore. He was a protector of values, a guardian of something greater than just the physical security of the Vatican. But what did that truly mean for him? How could he balance this newfound sense of humanity with the rigid rules of duty? Then came the day that would test everything. It started like any other, with a heightened sense of vigilance due to an impending VIP visit. Foreign diplomats were scheduled to meet with Pope Francis, and security was tighter than usual. Thomas stood at his post in the central courtyard, the steady rhythm of his breathing matching the stillness of the moment. His halberd was firmly in hand, his uniform immaculate, his gaze scanning the crowd as it slowly filled the square. But this time his instincts weren't just tuned to potential threats. Something felt off. There was a shift in the crowd. A woman, moving too quickly for the flow of the people, caught his eye. She was clutching a small child, both of them looking agitated, their eyes darting around nervously. As Thomas focused on them, he noticed the way they were pushing through. The crowd, their panic palpable. The mother was muttering to herself, as if trying to calm the child. But it was clear she wasn't in control of the situation. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward, his training kicking in but also guided by the lessons the Pope had taught him. He wasn't just going to stand by. As he approached, the woman's eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment he saw the desperation there. She was lost, both literally and figuratively, and in that instant, Thomas knew he couldn't ignore her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, his voice steady. "Are you all right? Can I help you?" The woman froze, startled at first, but then relief washed over her face. "I'm looking for my husband. We got separated in the crowd. I don't know where he is." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy. With empathy, without hesitation, he guided the woman and child to the exit, his role no longer just about watching from a distance, but actively protecting them. It was a simple act, but it felt like the most important one he had ever done. As they finally reunited with her husband, the woman thanked him profusely, her eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time, Thomas felt the true weight of his service. It wasn't about perfection or adherence to tradition. It was about stepping forward when it mattered most, showing compassion when it was needed. And in that moment he realized that the true measure of a protector wasn't in the uniform or the halberd. It was in the willingness to act with love and humanity. In the days that followed the incident with the woman and child, Thomas felt a quiet shift within him. The responsibility he carried as a Swiss guard had always been one of discipline and duty, but now something deeper was calling to him. He had acted with compassion, something he never thought possible when he first joined the guard. The weight of tradition had been heavy, but the relief he felt after helping that mother was unlike anything he had experienced. He realized that sometimes service meant more than just standing still. It meant stepping forward when someone needed protection, even if it meant breaking the rules. But as much as Thomas felt the weight of this new understanding, doubt still lingered. What if this new path wasn't truly what he was meant for? What if his break from protocol had been a mistake? He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to him like a shadow. The discipline of the guard, the traditions he had been raised to uphold, were deeply ingrained. How could he reconcile his growing empathy with the rigid expectations of his role? The answer came sooner than he expected. It was another routine day, but the atmosphere in Vatican City was different. There was a high-profile visit taking place. Foreign dignitaries, global leaders, and influential figures were in attendance. Security was tighter than ever. As Thomas stood at his post near the Vatican entrance, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. His instincts, sharpened over the years, were telling him to stay alert. It was then that he noticed something out of place, a figure moving through the crowd with urgency, their eyes darting around nervously. Before he could react, a shout pierced the air. It was faint but growing louder. Thomas's gaze snapped to the crowd and he saw a man, clearly agitated, pushing his way toward the gates. He was moving erratically, his hands clutching something tightly, a briefcase. The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd was beginning to take notice and panic set in. The man was heading straight toward the Pope's entourage. Thomas didn't hesitate. He had learned to trust his gut, and in this moment, it was telling him to act. Without a second thought, he broke from his post and moved through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been trained to protect with his life, but this wasn't just about protection. It was about preventing harm before it could escalate. As he reached the man, Thomas spoke calmly but firmly. "Sir, stop right there. What's in the briefcase?" The man froze, his eyes wild with fear. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Was it a weapon? A threat to the Pope? Thomas couldn't be sure, but he knew he had to keep control. The crowd was watching, waiting. "Please," the man stammered. I don't want trouble. I just need to speak to him. To the Pope. I have a message." The words hung in the air, and Thomas's gaze softened. The fear in the man's eyes wasn't malicious. It was desperation. In that moment, Thomas realized something. The role of a protector was not just to stand guard, but to understand when to listen, when to act with reason, and when compassion was needed. "Come with me," Thomas said gently, guiding the man. Away from the crowd, his instincts now fully aligned with his heart. The rest of the security team moved in, securing the area. But Thomas's actions had prevented a potential crisis. Once again, he had followed his heart. And once again, he felt certain that he had made the right choice. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story of compassion and duty. Thomas's journey from following rigid tradition to embracing the deeper meaning of service shows us that true leadership comes from the heart, not just from the rules. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between following the rules and doing what felt right? How did you handle it? What do you think is the true role of a protector, someone who follows orders, or someone who leads with compassion? We want to hear your perspective. Drop a comment below and share your experiences, insights, or any thoughts you have on this story. Your feedback and stories help us grow and connect as a community. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to stay updated with more thought-provoking content. Every week, we bring you new stories that explore the deeper sides of life, service, and the human heart. So make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for being a part of our journey, and we can't wait to hear from you.